Okay, so today we're going to have a chat about sustainability and digitalization and how the two work together or not, as the case may be, I guess, is the crux of the discussion. But the obvious place to start with, just off the back of COP26, a lot of talk went on. I think we're all aware of some of the promises that were made, and we might have different views. Everyone will have a slightly different view as to whether it was a huge success or more could have been done. I guess from the data center industry perspective, what was there any surprises, any sort of requirements, or how do you see it from a data center perspective?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Phil, and hello everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. You're right, it's a good place to start with the COP26. And you're also right, how you define success is really the way to look at it. I mean, from one perspective, it could be very successful. From another point of view, it may not be. I guess there are a couple of things which stand out for me. The first thing which stood out for me was that there is at least a general understanding amongst all the attendees, whether it's businesses or governments, that we probably just have about the next 10 years to go fix this issue. Right, so that's the first thing which stood out, which I think is relatively some sort of success. The second piece being that the next generation has to be very actively involved, and a classic example of that was the town hall, the round table, actually not the town hall, the round table which was done by Obama with the younger generation, because these are the people who are the future. So I think those two things really stand out for me. But bringing closer to the data center industry and taking the cue of the roundtable, the reality is that the attendees on the roundtable, or let's say the generation, is really going to be the next CIOs. So for them to start thinking about policy and what they want to do with their data centers and how they want to build them more sustainable versus what is being done today is really key. And that approach is going to be unique, I think, for the future. Now, when you look at data centers in particular, unfortunately, data centers also contribute to the overall carbon emissions, and there are various percentages. I mean, it looks like it's about 2% globally, although 2% seems small, but if you put this in perspective, it's equal to the airline industry. So 2% is big. So the point being, with these kind of decisions and the approach, and if 10 years is what is ahead of us, and the fact that the acceleration of digital has been extremely high in the last 2 years due to COVID, people working from home, online buying, etc., the need for more data centers, but to build more data centers, is even more profound right now. So from a data center industry perspective, there is a lot of effort which needs to happen really in the next decade.
Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing there is this sort of paradox, if you like, that you say digitalization is happening rapidly, and even more so during the pandemic. I guess everybody went online, hybrid working, etc. But sustainability theoretically demands us to consume less, and if you call data centers digital factories, as plenty of folks have, we're building more and more of these. So do you think it is possible to sort of meet both those demands, sustainability, i.e. reducing consumption, along with this sort of seemingly ever-growing data center industry?
It is possible, Phil, and then again, that's a great question. It is possible. When you think about building data centers, the big question is how we are building the data centers. So at Schneider, for example, we talk a lot about electrical and digital. And let me take a minute to explain what that really means. When we say electric being the most sustainable form of energy, so the more electric, the better the data center is. And within electric, if you think about today, from a grids perspective, still 70 to 80% of global grids are burning fossil fuel. So which means your primary source of energy is still a lot burning fossil fuel. So how can we make sure that we start moving the primary source of energy towards renewables, right? So that's the first starting point. So if you do that, which means you source more and more from renewables, the next important piece is the physical infrastructure which you're building has to be with highly efficient products. And I really mean products here. So whether it's your switch gears or your UPSs or your cooling systems, etc., they have to be highly efficient. And those are also possible. I mean, the kind of equipment which is available today for data center physical infrastructure the level of efficiency is very different from what it used to be in the past. So that's the second piece. And the third piece is where we talk about the digital aspect. So the digital aspect being software on the top of this physical layer, which means more and more visibility on the entire life cycle of design, build, operate, and maintain. So while you're designing, so if you actually are able to, we have an example of one software which we have called RIB. It's a company we acquired a couple of years ago. So if you do the design and build based on those kind of softwares, then you try to take out all the engineering changes which happen during the process of build. So you're trying to see them much in advance. So a lot of waste gets taken out from there. Similarly, in how you operate and maintain your data centers. So the point I'm trying to make is a lot of digitization, meaning a lot of more data centers. But if we do these three pieces, which is better sourcing of energy through renewables, better equipment, which is much more in terms of efficiency, much higher efficiency, and with digital, which is software at design, build, operate, and maintain, it's possible to make highly sustainable and way more data centers.
And when you're talking about a highly sustainable data center, are you talking mainly here about greenfield new builds? Because clearly if you start with a blank piece of paper, all you've talked about is relatively easy to implement and therefore build a very efficient, sustainable data center. But clearly the industry has a large sort of legacy data center estate. Quite a lot of those, I mean, I know there've been, large strides made to improve them, but they, I guess, have limitations, shall we say, on what's possible. So do you think at some stage there may have to be a decision to, if you like, turn the lights off of a lot of these legacy and replace them with these newer, more efficient data centers?
I mean, it really depends on data center by data center, really. Let's take one hypothetical example. If the data center, which is a legacy data center, has been built in a place where the chances of getting any source of alternate renewable energy is impossible, then there's really nothing you can do about it, right? Unless you start creating your own virtual power plants, which some customers do, by the way. It's not an impossible task, but of course it's a lot capital intensive, right? So that's the first aspect. Secondly, if the powertrain has been designed in a way that you cannot replace equipment and bring in new equipment with much higher level of efficiency, then that's another challenge. And then if you can't do that, that means you can't even bring software on top of it. Then of course that is a type of data center where the lights should shut off eventually. I hate saying that, but I don't think that's the situation most places. Most places, out of these three vectors of sustainable energy, or let's say renewable energy, highly efficient physical infrastructure, and software, it is possible to do some turnarounds and look at the data center. And that's why there are all these options available today. For example, we as Schneider, we are happy to go in and do a complete assessment of the data centers to actually talk about, okay, from a sustainability perspective, where do we stand today and where can we bring it to in the next couple of years. But the one important point you made is, if none of these pieces can happen, the hard decision is you'll have to shut the lights off. And more often than not, it would probably be at the end of its life cycle in any case. It may be completely maxed out. The equipment may be more than a decade plus old, etc. So it may be time to switch it off in any case.
And in terms of that sort of location piece, as you say, obviously the legacy, they are where they are. But in terms of moving forward, building, clearly there are certain applications where latency is the number one driving factor. So the data center has to be somewhere fairly close to the actual application. But in a lot of cases, I'm thinking it's not that, but a few milliseconds here, there really doesn't matter. Do you think there might be an increase build in certain geographical locations because they have some of these natural advantages you've referenced? And if I'm allowed to ask a supplementary, apologies, but set aside to that, we've got this whole edge infrastructure, which again, location is important, but in a sense, you don't have the option because you're moving it very close to local consumption, creation, whatever, of data. So just some thoughts on those two things, building data centers ideally in suitable geographical locations, but also then edge demand possibly going against that because you have to build it near the application.
Yeah, and I think these are two very different, I shouldn't say application, but two very different type of ways to build data centers depending on what you're trying to service. So I think your point is exactly right. the locations which have those geographical advantage will and should be the locations where more and more data centers are built. I mean, like, for example, if it's a cooler environment, then your need for cooling the data center is lesser, which means the need to consume energy is lesser. On top of that, if in the same location you also have a lot of renewable, that's a perfect location to go build a data center, right? But then how many such locations exist all over the world? There are certain geographies where you can do that, but there are a lot of geographies you can't do that, right? For example, in Asia, there are seldom any places where you can think about an environment like that, right? So you're right. I mean, those locations will be in demand. I think they're already in demand and they'll continue to be in demand. Now, your point about the edge sort of environment, now that's where latency actually plays a very important role. And the reason edge exists, in a way, if you think about one of the top reasons it exists is because of latency. Because you want to make sure that your creation of data, buffering, etc., is closer to your customers, so that there's no latency and the experience, the user experience is seamless. So yes, in the edge environment, it really depends on where your customers are. Whether you think of Netflix type of data centers or you think of retail type of data centers, edge environments, those are usually closer to the customers where they are. Now, the point is the size of that edge environment is what is crucial. If it is a single rack, two rack type of a data center, yes, it needs to be sustainable, but it really depends on where it is hosted. And more often than not, it will be hosted in a building. So it's really depends on what's inside the building's physical infrastructure. But if it's a larger data center, like a regional type of data center for an edge application, then of course you can make those choices again. But again, depends really on where your customers are.
Okay, and in terms of the slightly broader picture, I mean, data centers obviously exist for a reason, not just to sort of serve themselves. And digitalization is what they are, if you like. They're the foundation on which this whole digital transformation piece is being built. I'm just wondering again, is that, do you think it's truly possible to be sustainable and use this disruptive digital technology to move forwards, or at some stage do those two sort of objectives clash and you have to either stop being as disruptive, innovative, or you have to accept there's a bit of a compromise on the sustainability side?
Not really. I actually think it's the contrary. Digital and the disruption in innovation which is happening is moving more and more towards sustainability. So which is the direction we want to go in. So case in point, I was giving you, and I'll maybe please share it one more time. When you think of software and the design and build softwares, the RIB example which I gave you, what it does is that it takes out the waste at the actual build. So basically what it is doing is it is visualizing in different Ds how you're going to deploy and build your data center. So which is you're actually building it, but not really building it. So at that time, because you're visualizing it way in advance, when you're actually going out to physically build the data center, you're saving almost 20%. So options like these and innovations like these are actually helping even further to go in the sustainability environment. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, while the need of data centers is going up, the innovation towards sustainability is also going up, which means there is a possibility, clear, and it's clear right now. There's a possibility that you can build way more data centers, but they're still more and more sustainable and good for the environment. I mean, not good for the environment, but better for the environment overall.
And in terms of the lifeblood of all this digital transformation is data. And I'm just wondering there, the cliche expression is data is the new oil, which probably now after COP26 and this focus on sustainability probably isn't a great thing to say, is it? Because oil is about to get kicked into touch. But I'm wondering, though, data itself is potentially, again, it's got this double edge that is clearly incredibly valuable and driving a lot of the innovation and success for companies. Yeah. But also, by the same token, because we're all being encouraged that every little bit of data we ever produce might be incredibly valuable when it probably won't be, we're keeping more and more of this stuff, which is keeping data centers in business with lots of racks and cabinets full of storage, which the contents of which we'll probably never use. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, again, do we need some restrictions on data usage, or is it okay to have a data free for all and we'll sort of pick up the pieces?
I guess the big question is how do you apply a restriction like that? I mean, I think we are all guilty, or at least I am guilty of taking so many pictures on the phone, and they just sit there, right? And in the new technology from the phones, you can just take like burst of pictures, and each picture is data, right? And it is sitting somewhere, I mean, in the cloud and so on. Do we ever use those again? To your point, probably not, right? So innovation on the data center side, so that even if, let's say, to store more and more data, you build more and more data centers, is important. So that's something which companies like ourselves do. I also know for a fact that companies which are more focused on, for example, the data itself, the storage of the data itself, they're also doing a lot of innovation. Like I was told recently, I was reading, I can't remember exactly where, but I was reading that when you take all these pictures, especially that kind of data, so it's the type of data which is important, that kind of data, they store it at certain level of layers, which is not getting processed at all, unless there is AI, and then they put AI there, which means that if you're actually using more of your pictures, then your data is getting processed. So which means it's just sitting there, right? Whereas if you're not, for somebody like me who's not looking at the pictures at all, then it's basically going and sitting in a library and it's never getting processed again, unless I want to process it again, right? So there is innovation on storage as well. Collectively, all of this has to lead to, the question which you asked. But the big question to my mind is, how do you apply a restriction? I mean, it's almost like saying that, okay, from tomorrow we will only sell, and this is one example, but we'll only sell 16 GB phones and not more than that. So you have a limitation, right? And you cannot take more pictures, because that's, will we ever get there? I hope we don't have to get there, but and we start to do other pieces of what is required, which is, looking at renewable sources of energy, right? Starting to become greener in terms of how we consume energy, so that becomes an important aspect, using more efficient equipment, using more and more software, etc.
And in terms of the supply chain, I'm wondering as well, because clearly that's been in the news again, not necessarily for sustainability reasons, but obviously there's been a lot of chaos during the pandemic. Factories not making things, and then lack of transport to get goods and services places. But I'm just wondering whether that is another angle that the data center industry needs to perhaps look at. I mean, at the moment, like every industry, I guess, the supply chains are global, and is that again sustainable long term? Do you think, to ship UPSs or whatever it is all around the world, or do you think manufacturing bases might move slightly closer to some of the markets they're serving over time?
It has. I mean, COVID in particular has pointed to that in terms of a direction, that the closer that you can be to your customer environment from a manufacturing and innovation standpoint, the better it is. Now, is this something which can be shifted overnight? I mean, that's a huge challenge. I mean, at least at Schneider, I can tell you we are very region based. So we do like US for US, China for China, Asia for Asia, etc. So we do that. But is it still enough? I mean, the irony of the situation is, today we live in a time where, while we have a supply chain problem, rightly, like you explained, is more because of the chaos which it is causing. Plus, of course, it is because of COVID as well. Things just change so quickly, and now we have a new variant. Now, who knows what is the impact of that variant on all of this? Now, if the travel stop, and if the business starts to go down, will it mean still supply chain challenges, or maybe the demand is coming down? So we are living in a very, very, very unique world, and we really need to be super agile to be able to impact change as we go, as we learn, like literally every single day, week, month.
And in terms of I guess the incentives for changing, do you think the data center industry thus far has sort of kept its own house in order pretty well when it comes to sustainability, and can therefore be trusted to do that moving forwards? Or do you think governments, I know in the continent, and I think even in Asia as well, certain countries or individual cities are beginning to query when someone applies to build a new data center? They want to know a lot more about it than they would have 5 years ago in terms of its environmental. So I guess, can the data industry self-regulate, or do you think it's inevitable that local and or national legislation will begin to push them in a certain direction?
Well, first off, I think let's look at this from a data center industry perspective. I mean, this is a fairly advanced in terms of innovation and thinking point of view type of an industry. I mean, think about the innovation in technologies which this industry has been driving, both for the data, for computing, and for physical infrastructure for the last 3 decades already. So it's not that the data center industry is, I mean, relatively comparing, this industry, data center industry, is a fairly advanced and futuristic type of an industry. So that's the good news. Now, relatively versus some of the other industries, we are definitely doing a much better job. I guess the big question is, beyond all these regulations, etc., I mean, it's almost becoming an existential issue at hand. And back to our discussion on COP26, I mean, if it is only 10 years left, I mean, the big question is, how long are you going to wait to go impact change? Where is the pivot? So the pivot really is like now, right? So I feel more confident, I'd say, from the data center industry perspective, just because of the history of innovation and the speed at which it's being brought into real application. Now, do countries play an important role? Of course, they play an important role. I mean, if countries start to restrict how many data centers have to be built in what location and what environment, etc., that is definitely helpful. Like Europe, in fact, where you folks are, is one of a classic example there. You know, where there are so many legislations already in countries where you can't just go and build a data center if you wanted to. So you got to live by all those norms.
And in terms of what we discussed, I mean, as you have outlined, the industry has been pretty good at innovating. But if you like, it's been an evolution, gradual. Do you think that can continue, or do you think we will need a revolution in the same way, if you like, that COP26 said that coal and gas are going to be eliminated in a fairly sort of tight time frame? Does the data center industry, alongside that, need to say, okay, by 2025 or 2030, we're not going to touch coal and gas and we'll rely on renewables? And I know those obviously have their challenges, but and I say some kind of revolution, or as you say, build data centers with their own solar panel power plant next door, or whatever it is. How much revolution, innovation does there need to be, or can they just carry on sort of on the roadmap that we're on at the moment?
Well, there are a couple of pieces to your question. First, when you think about the entire data center industry and you start looking at all the big players, right, whether it's your hyperscalers or your colos, etc., are they taking important missions to become carbon neutral by 2025 or 2020 or 2030 or not, right? So a large majority already is. So which means they already have a plan by which they're going to build all the data centers which are going to be built globally. It's basically these customers who build it, right? These companies. So that is a good direction. And most of the data center players have taken carbon emission type of, let's say, commitments by 2030. So which means the next decade. Okay, so that's now we need to stick to that, and we need to go build against those missions. The other important aspect then is that if we are doing it in that process, do you have enough innovation to support it? And I guess this innovation also is there, which is the role where we play. People like Schneider Electric, companies like Schneider, where we play the role in terms of innovating and bringing more and more innovative solutions. So I think the important point now is measurement. If you think about it, more than a decade ago, we started talking about PUE, right? And that became like a measurement, and that like everybody started to look at each other saying, okay, if we are all data center players, my data center is 1.1, yours is 1.3, etc. How do we compare ourselves? I think that sort of a measurement is what is important now from a sustainability standpoint, because it's not just about PUE, which was power utilization. It's not just about power. It's about power, it's about cooling, it's about sourcing of energy, it's about your geographic location, where you're getting the water from, etc. So there are a lot of those other aspects, and that's going to be important to set up something like a PUE, which is what we will all measure ourselves against as a data center industry. I'm pretty positive. Like, I know we are already working on something like that. I'm pretty positive the industry is going to come up with something pretty soon.
And in terms of the industry, I mean, I perhaps slightly flippantly say that in the early days they plant a few trees to offset their carbon emissions and say they were doing a great job. Do you think most of them are now aware that, although I'm not saying planting trees isn't a good idea, but we need to move beyond that basic? And I guess we're coming into this sort of greenwashing, what the definition of that might mean, different people might have different views, but do you think the industry is certainly moving beyond the sort of easy and sort of looks good, but maybe if you look under the covers, is not actually achieving a lot. They're aware that they've got to stop or move from that to real, progress, real achievements.
I feel very confident about it. I mean, it's not about, you're right. I mean, it's not about planting trees. I mean, yes, it's a good thing to plant trees, which we all should be doing in any case, but it's not just about that. I mean, to the extent that some of our large data center customers are trying to go even beyond the carbon credit. Because credit is a credit, it doesn't mean you're building an infrastructure which is the most sustainable, right? So I feel very confident that the direction and the speed at which the data center industry is going to look at what we want to address within the next decade, I think we are definitely at the right speed. And again, I think it's not about somebody coming and putting a let's say a sort of a rule or a regulation here. Rules and regulations are important, have to exist. I think the big question for mankind really is existential right now, and it's not just for data center industry, as we all know. It's beyond. It's transportation. It's so many other industries, manufacturing. It's everybody has to play their part, but have to play their part in the next 10 years.
And as an organization, I mean, I years ago I worked, well, I still do a bit of work in the water industry, and I bumped into you there because I think you bought telemechanique and people who do drives and controls and stuff. So I guess you have sort of presence in many industries, if not all, and you also have a global presence. So I guess you have a fairly unique overview of the sustainability, both from an industry perspective and different parts of the world. So do you have any sort of observations or thoughts as to which industries, not naming and shaming, but just some idea of where the data center industry sits and what other industries are doing well, and if there are any regional variations the company comes across?
It's a very hard question for me to answer, because it can get super generic, and I like you said, I don't want to be the one doing the blame and shame here, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the data center industry is definitely very advanced. And now, of course, I'm closer to their industry, then that's my scope of what I do versus some of the other industries. Now, is there effort from all the industries? There's definitely. The other thing important is, like, let's take the example of mining. While the industry or the mining companies are putting in a lot of effort, but their dependence on the local governments and local infrastructure is very, very high. So, and the local regulation then as it comes into play. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is the degrees of freedom which we have as a data center industry to impact the sustainability change is higher than somebody who's doing mining, because it really depends a lot of local regulation, and it depends on the country. So from that perspective, plus the fact that the data center industry has been rather innovative and futuristic for the last couple of decades, it's working in the favor of moving at a much faster pace.
And do you think collaboration, because I know you as an organization, I know I've been to various presentations where you're highlight all the innovations you are doing, particularly with some of the hardware manufacturers, etc. Do you think collaboration is essential as well, part of this puzzle, that different people from different parts of the industry need to work together collectively? Otherwise, it's it's not possible to achieve the optimum, I guess, sustainability solutions, if that makes sense.
At a larger level, yes. In the sense, if you think about the grid, right? I mean, what can we do to reduce the load on the grid? Let's say if we took an ambition, we have to reduce it by 50% over the next 10 years, which means aggregation is important, which means wherever you're creating renewable sources, you have to be able to share it, whether it's a residence or a home or a commercial building or a large building, etc. You have to be able to share so that you share amongst each other, so the load on the grid goes down, right? So that's on the larger perspective. Within the data center space, it's a slight dichotomy, because on one side you're competing with each other, right? I mean, whether you're a hyperscaler or a colo, etc. On the other side, it's probably a good idea to start sharing the sources of energy, right? But is that your competitive advantage then if multiple people are getting it from the same source? That's something which is an important aspect to think about. I don't know whether we are at that stage yet, but it's a good point you're making, and maybe something to think about for the future.
And in terms, just to sort of nearly finishing, that resiliency, Traditionally, data centers, you know, N plus whatever on that site. I remember a few years ago when I was over in the States with you folks, there was an idea that instead of having one large data center with all the infrastructure required there, you might almost have, you know, 20 small data centers distributed, and you could sort of, you know, if one of those went down, you could obviously fail over and rebalance. You know, that's similar to, I guess, Google has, you know, millions of servers, and if one goes down, you just rebalance the load. Are those kind of innovations, do you think we're needing more of that kind of thinking to help in the future when it comes to building out data center infrastructure?
See, the part about having a backup plan from a disaster recovery perspective, that still remains, you know, because the other challenges with what's happening to the climate events are also becoming almost a norm. Something which was an event once in 100 years, these are like much once in 10 years and so on, right? So the need to build disaster recovery from a data center perspective still remains, and it remains. The point about versus one large, make 20 smaller ones, that really depends on application. If it's an edge type of application, you need to build those 20 because you need to have those smaller ones closer to your customers. But if your environment is a large compute type of environment for a web giant, as an example, then you don't really need to do that, right? I mean, you could still build one very big data center and actually run it in a fashion. And it's easier to control too, by the way. When you build one big in one location, it's easier to control. Edge brings its own challenges because if you have 20 small ones, the fact is, yes, you can monitor them remotely through software, etc. But still there are these 20 places which you have to monitor versus one large location. So depending on application.
Okay, so maybe in sort of finishing up, I mean, we're all potentially going to be impacted to a certain extent. So I guess the question is, do you think that businesses are going to have to make some sort of commercial sacrifices on the way towards the sustainability that we're requiring, or do you think it will be possible to be completely commercial, whether you call it capitalism, whatever you want to call it, and, you know, be sustainable at the same time, or there will have to be the odd compromise, you know, whether it's just something as simple as business, you know, we're talking on Zoom today rather than physical meetings, you know, companies might have to work out, you know, that a mixture, sort of hybrid approach works best, etc. Yeah, just some thoughts as to what will or not be required.
And look, Phil, it's not just a data center industry challenge, right? It goes back to the point I was making about existential, right? Now, electrical vehicle is case in point. More often than not, they're slightly more expensive, or sometimes way more expensive than the regular gas guzzlers, right? The challenge is, do we all want to make a switch? When do we make a switch? Is that a green premium we need to pay? And what is the right amount of the green premium, right? I mean, as a customer, am I willing to pay 5%, 10, 15, 20, you know, depends. So from the perspective of green premiums, and I'm just giving it a name, green premiums, it's sort of the point I'm trying to make is that there is a cost to innovation, right? Now, when you think of the bigger picture and the challenge for the planet and the fact that we have 10 years left, as an industry or beyond this industry, all businesses, should we be considering, you know, bringing in those green premiums into our P&Ls so that we can go fix this problem or not? I think there is a very clear answer to it. The question is, how do you do it and how fast do you do it? But then the other big question is back to the point about the pivot. Where is the pivot? What if we are not able to do all of that and we are 10 years too late? So will there be a need to do it, right? And there's no need, and we're, you know, on a downward spiral. So I guess the point is, at any point in the lifetimes of industries, etc., there is a cost to innovation, and there is a rapid innovation needed now, which is happening. So there is definitely a cost. All of that is going towards sustainability, hence we're calling it a green premium or whatever else we want to call it. Is it required for the data center industry? I mean, it is definitely required for data center industry. It's required for every industry in general. You know, I give you the example of electrical vehicle also. So I think it's almost necessary.
Okay, maybe in finishing, I think I perhaps know the answer from the answers you give me to the questions. But when it comes to this, whether you call it existential or whatever, are you a glass half empty or half, you know, half full? Do you think we have the necessary will and technologies to sort of get there in time, or do you sometimes think, oh dear, this is all going a bit, you know, horribly wrong, and maybe it's not going to work out for the best?
I mean, look, I'm an optimist. First of all, I mean that's my nature. But I'm an optimist with data, and from the perspective of the data center industry, I think there's enough data pointing to the fact that we can definitely do our part in the next 10 years. Now, can we do that overall for the planet from all industries? I mean, that's something which is it's a difficult question to answer, and that probably needs a way more data than I can assimilate right now. But I do feel positive that the appreciation of the challenge ahead of us is now beyond an industry. It's all people, all walks of life, and I think nature has its own ways of showing us, especially with the kind of climate events which are happening. It is becoming clear that if you don't fix this, these will become more, and the point back onto the pivot part. So to me, I feel positive.
Excellent. Well, it's been really, really enjoyable to chat to you. So Pankaj, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. It was a pleasure. And thank you, everyone.